So I'm here and I'm due to be on in about an hour's time, and there's Wogan House there for Radio 2. So I'm going to be talking about blood clots and pulmonary embolisms. Hopefully getting some awareness out there, so heading on in.
Suddenly find it difficult to breathe, you start gasping for air. You might feel slightly dizzy and nauseous, and your chest might hurt whenever you take a breath. Classic thought would be, oh no, heart attack. But not quite. It's what happened to my guest today, Paul Bradley. He had something called a pulmonary embolism, in fact, a blockage of an artery in the lungs. Pulmonary embolisms are usually caused by a blood clot, fat particles or air bubbles forming elsewhere in the body and moving up to the lungs. Depending on the size of the blockage, it can feel like anything from a slight chest cold to a collapsed lung. And if left untreated, pulmonary embolisms could cause long-term damage to your body, your heart, even put your life at risk. So what warning signs should we watch out for, and what can we do to prevent an embolism forming? Radio 2's Dr. Sarah Jarvis is here. Hello.
I'm here.
And also, we have with us Paul Bradley, and you're a fit young guy, but you have one of these.
I have. Thank you for having me on your show, Jeremy. I'm 46 and I've loved running since I was 11 years old, and I just love being involved, going to events. And I'm in the sports and outdoors industry, so I get invitations to a lot of events, running, cycling events. And I do a lot of long haul flights as well, although I don't think this was, it didn't have an implication of how this happened to me this time, I don't think. But it was on the 1st of January this year that I decided to up my running to, because I've got my own business, during our busiest time, I don't run as much as I'd like to. So January, new sort of goals, and I decided that I wanted to do 25 miles a week. So I started upping my running, and it was a really busy February. I was in Munich at shows, and I started keeping up my running. I was hitting my goal of 25 miles a week. And then I went to a cycling event, a 24-hour cycling event. And why I mentioned this was I had to travel 7 hours there and 7 hours back.
Right.
And I think at that point I was fitting a lot in, traveling a lot. I might have been dehydrated, not looking after myself as much as I should have, stretching, etc. But it was after that event, I took 5 days off, and then I started running again. And I remember having a little tweak in my calf. I was documenting everything on video for just vlogging what I was up to my followers. And then that weekend, I did a 10-mile fell run up at Rothbury in Northumberland. And I've done it before, and I really wanted to better my time. And I remember it's 10 miles, it's 5 miles up to 1,400 feet and then 5 miles down. And I remember 2 miles in, it was like someone had dialed down my lungs. I was gasping for air.
Really? And that's a very unusual feeling.
Yeah, for me, I've never had this before. I've been running a long time, and I train on hills anyway. But I remember at that point thinking, because I had a cold running up to it, thinking, I think I should step out of this race. And but I didn't. I calmed myself down, carried on, and I did really well. I got great time. I came 14th out of 300 runners.
Wow.
So, but on those times, and you can, when I looked at my app that showed me my times, that mile 3 and 4, I was a lot slower, and that was when I was trying to gather my breath, etc. But then the next day, I travelled 5 hours back home. I then got on a flight to New York to see my younger brother. Mm-hmm. Got up at 5:30 again, not wanting to miss any running time. Ran 5.5 miles round Central Park, and I was out of breath. And I remember actually on the flight from to New York, I had a little twinge in my chest. And as you get older, you just have, well, for me, I noticed it But I thought, no, don't be daft. Everything is, you've got a tight chest from that event. And but I remember running around Central Park, out of breath, and a really, really tight chest. And that afternoon, after the event, I was walking around sightseeing with my wife, and I felt slightly dizzy, and then chest pains, and the chest pain was uncommon. That was coming on pretty quick. And that was when that was when, looking back now, that's when this was the start of what happened.
Okay, did you think that was a heart attack then?
No, I don't know why. In fact, my wife caught me Googling on my phone in a coffee house, looking at, I thought chest infection, and I thought it was pneumonia. Daft, and I shouldn't Google.
Right. But had you seen Paul at that point, Sarah, what would you have said?
Had I seen Paul at that point, I'd have said you had breathlessness that came on before the heart attack. Before the chest pain. We definitely need to rule out a heart attack, and yes, it could be pneumonia, although with pneumonia you're less likely to get chest pain. If you've got pneumonia near the edges of the lungs, you can get pleurisy. That's inflammation of the pleura, which are the inner and outer linings of the lungs, and that can cause sharp stabbing chest pain when you breathe. But that's a very, very common symptom of pulmonary embolus as well. Now, you're not high risk, but I would undoubtedly have been looking, before probably I looked at a heart attack, I'd have been looking for a pulmonary embolus.
And how would you actually diagnose? Well, how were you diagnosed, Paul?
Well, I was daft because when I was in New York, I didn't want anything to get in the way of I was only there 3 days. I was there to see my younger brother as well. So I didn't want to ruin the trip. And I did think must be a chest infection. But when I woke up the next morning, I couldn't sleep on my side, on either side. And even getting up I was in pain. And I had to take painkillers for the pain, and I still carried on,
right.
Which was ridiculous.
Did you?
And I did just think, well, let's get back home and I'll see my GP.
Okay. Well, so when did you get medical attention?
So I had 3 days.
Sarah's
of
head
these,
is now in her hands.
I had 3 days of the pains getting progressively worse, and I should have gone to a doctor over there.
You
definitely.
really should.
So please, I'm not saying that's what.
Did you?
Yep, I flew back with it. So
wow. And then what happened then?
I then I called my my doctors for an emergency appointment. There wasn't one, so I went to my local drop-in. They did some vital sign checks and standard checks. I passed all of those, but they weren't happy because they didn't have the correct equipment to do further checks. So they suggested I go to A&E. So I then drove myself to A&E in Cheltenham, and they were fantastic. At this point, I still didn't think it was that serious, and I thought it was amazing that the A&E, within 15 minutes, I was already in a gown and ECG'd up, and they were working out. And by the way, they were fantastic.
And they would give what, clot busters would they, Sarah?
Yes, they would have given something. Well, and depending on how late it was. So normally you would immediately have there are two different kinds of treatment. One is heparin, which is given straight away, followed by warfarin, and that's the one which we have always given long term, and when it is very effective, but it does carry quite a few risks. These days we're much more likely in most places to give something called a DOAC, which is a direct oral anticoagulant, and those ones work much more quickly. You don't need to adjust the dose, they don't have the same interactions and so on.
And my question is whether Paul, as soon as he came in, I thought, oh, you're looking well, because we first met a few years ago on a different story. Whether there's any long-term damage to his lungs because he waited so long?
Well, unfortunately, the answer is you do look fantastic, and I'm delighted to hear that you're back running again, but you are much more likely to end up long-term damage if you don't get treatment. So this really is a medical emergency. And of course, just as an aside, I didn't know before I met you today that you were abroad at the time. Just a reminder to everyone, if you're going off on holiday this summer, please get your health insurance up to date.
So what's happened in his body when that goes on?
So almost certainly what's happened is he had a clot on the leg called a DVT, a deep vein thrombosis. The interesting thing is that overall there is possibly some evidence that very intense physical activity might increase this risk. We see it, for instance, in American footballers apparently. But On the whole, I do not ever want to hear anyone coming into my surgery or any other saying, oh, well, I don't want to exercise, I don't want to get a DVT, because actually the less you exercise, the more time you spend sitting, the more likely you are to have a DVT.
Yeah. And we associate them with plane flights, don't we?
We do associate them with plane flights, but actually it's not a huge risk. We used to talk a lot about economy class syndrome. There are other things which are much, much bigger causes. For instance, having cancer increases your risk because your blood tends to be more prone to clotting. If you've been immobile, if you've been in a plaster cast, if you've had surgery, particularly on your pelvis, people who are overweight are at higher risk. The combined oral contraceptive pill increases your risk, but it's a small increase. Pregnancy actually increases your risk much more. Being dehydrated was one of the things you did say.
Yeah.
Now, the clot on the leg often doesn't have any symptoms in people with pulmonary emboli. What happens, though, is that clot on the leg is in a vein, and veins, of course, carry blood back to the heart. So they carry it round to the right-hand side of the heart. It gets pumped through those two chambers in the right-hand side, then it goes back to the lungs, which is where it's going to collect oxygen. Then it will go back to the heart, and this oxygenated blood will be pumped back around the body to supply oxygen to our vital organs. The problem is the blood vessels it's going through are getting bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger as they get towards the heart, and then they go through the heart up to the right-hand side of the lung, up the right-hand side of the heart to the lungs, and of course suddenly you're back in tiny territory, tiny artery territory.
I see. So that's where
that's
we
why
get
it gets stuck.
I see. Any previous history, Paul, that you can tell us about?
Well, my dad has had clots before, but he's diabetic. So the first thing I wanted to check out post that was, have I got diabetes? And I've been cleared of diabetes. So other than my dad, my father having a clot before...
You've got a very healthy lifestyle. I don't think I could just tell.
I think
you don't
I think
booze
I have,
a lot, do you?
No, I don't. I have a couple of glasses of wine on a Friday before I'm tired, I'm zonked out. My wife makes sure I eat the vegetables and a balanced diet.
So are we in that classic area of saying at a certain point in life, and was it 46 you are?
Yeah, 46.
That's where, if you still behave like you're 26, the body's going to take you down. That's a great doctor's rule. You're in Sniper's Alley.
Yeah, you're not really. I don't want to stop people from going out running when they're 46. I don't want anyone ever being able to say... Stress is not great, and that may mean you don't look after yourself as well. You do, of course. Smoking increases your risk of clots because it makes the blood more sticky. Drinking a lot of alcohol makes you more dehydrated. There are other things. Sometimes it does run in families. Now, interestingly, there's a clotting abnormality which makes you more prone to clots. So I would always be asking about that in somebody where I suspected it. It may have been the diabetes in your father's case, but it's possible you've got something like, there's a condition called factor V Leiden, and that there you can have a family history.
When I turned 50, I started taking 75 milligrams of aspirin every day.
Did you?
To avoid this happening. Okay. That's since been debunked.
Yeah.
I'm still taking it.
Okay.
Would that stop me getting a pulmonary embolism?
It might reduce your risk slightly, but you are increasing the risk of bleeding from your stomach. It is surprisingly common,
is it?
Even at 75 milligrams. So interestingly, that honestly, the fortunes of aspirin have gone up and down and up and down. 20 years ago, it was the answer to every maiden's prayer, because if you've had a heart attack or stroke, it can cut your risk of having another one by an amazing 22%, just that teeny 75 milligram baby aspirin. So then we kind of extended it and thought, well, people with type 2 diabetes, they're at high risk, we'll give it to them as well, stop them having a heart attack or stroke. Then we thought, well, let's just give it to everybody.
Yeah.
Let's basically put
That's
it in the
where I
bath water.
came to get on the train, yeah.
The problem is that if your risk of heart attack or stroke is very high, as it is once you've had a heart attack and stroke, then yes, the benefits do dramatically outweigh the risks. But even for people with diabetes, we think it's probably a slightly different mechanism, their heart attacks, so it doesn't seem to protect them very much. And for people who are not at particularly high risks, at risk of heart attack, the risks probably outweigh the benefits, unless you have a strong family history of colon cancer, in which case taking aspirin for at least 5 years could significantly reduce your risk there.
I thought you had to take the entero-coated ones.
The enteric-coated ones make no difference to the inside of your stomach at all, unless you're taking more than 300 milligrams a day.
All right. Were you taking an aspirin a day?
No.
Okay.
And I think there was one thing that I would have changed was in that really busy time when I wasn't running, to then go back into January and then just ramp it up to 25 miles a week. And to some people, that's nothing, but they've stepped it up in, increments. And I think if you're going to be exercising, I'm an all or nothing guy, really. I can turn up to events and not trained and give it my all, and that's it. And the one thing I would like to change, well, I should have done, was train properly and gradually.
And any other 46-year-olds who run a lot and are busy, hectic life, anything you want to say to them, just by way of a personal tip?
Take it easy. And birds to know, it's do everything in balance. So increments, slow increments of increasing, and I've definitely got more of a balance of my view of everything in life now.
Thank you very much indeed. Paul Bradley, is it Chile Tech?
Chile Technology, yes.
Thank you. Suffered a pulmonary embolism in February 2019. Talking to Dr. Sarah Jarvis, who will stay with us. You call us 08000 288 291. Thank you, Paul, very much indeed.
Thank you very much.
So that's my Radio 2 with Jeremy. The interview with Jeremy over. I think it went okay. A little bit nervous at the start. I'm glad that's done. Hopefully it'll create some awareness of blood clots and pulmonary embolism. So, right, get to the office.